Okay, here we go. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is. I hope it's good to be where you are, because it is certainly good to be here. My name is Baltimore Fats, and this is Mud City. Yeah, okay, here we go. So, hello, friends. I hope everybody's doing well today. This is Mount Royal Station in Baltimore. But this episode is not about Mount Royal Station in Baltimore, but rather I'm just going to use it as the jump off point because my story it begins here. And there will be a full episode about Mount Royal Station coming very, very soon. It is one of those buildings that before I understood what mud flood was, or at least what that type of catastrophe could have happened, was a building that made no sense to me. It made absolutely zero sense to me. And then when I, discovered mud flood theory, it's like, oh my God, Mount Royal Station makes so much more sense to me. Now it makes absolute sense. So that's why there will be a full video. But I had gone by it the other day, and it made me think, I should do some research on it because I did want to do a video on it. I thought its time has come. So, and I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to go ahead quickly to get to where I want to be. I just had no good cold opening to this story, so it needs to be led there. So I was doing some history stuff. I was looking at the building, right, and I noticed, of course, that it has an architect. I'm like, great, let's find out about this architect, right? So Ephraim Francis Baldwin, right, and I'm gonna get all into him when I do my Mount Royal video. And so I was reading about him, and I want to find out about where he learned his trade, and he learned it from these guys. And so I clicked on this guy, right, and he was an architect for the railroad, right, and look, he designed this thing, and I love this thing here because I don't know about you, but all I can think about is there's a massive church buried under the ground here, and this is just one of the spires of it that is still standing today. And this guy learns under Latrobe, who I'm going to get into. He did the cathedral in Washington, D.C. Crazy, these architectural connections and the similarity to all this architecture. It's going to get nuts. And so here it just goes into some of the buildings that he did. And I was reading along, and I saw that he did the Johns Hopkins Hospital, which is a major landmark in Baltimore, right? And the Johns Hopkins Colored Children Orphan Asylum. And I was like, did I just read that right? And so I needed to find out about the Johns Hopkins Colored Children Orphan Asylum. Right? And so this is just a little bit of the Johns Hopkins, the person, his Wikipedia. And again, there's going to be, like, I can imagine a whole series of episodes about Johns Hopkins in the future. And no doubt about that. Sorry, just getting my timer going. I need it for this one. This Gilman guy they talk about here, he was like the executor of Hopkins's will and his estate and everything, right? And so they established the orphan asylum a year before the hospital, actually, or it's before the hospital, right? And it was praised by The Nation, which is one of the oldest magazines, and I don't know what its political bent is now. I looked at it a little bit. There was a cool picture of an old cover of it, I think. Maybe if I actually click on it, but I'm not going to do that. So The Nation magazine in Baltimore, American, this is a local paper, I guess. And they said the local paper said that the asylum was a place where, in quotes, nothing was wanting that could benefit science and humanity, end quote. And to me, that is an amazing statement. I get the humanity aspect of it because you want the orphans to be well cared for. You want them to have beds and food and be clean and education and care and so forth. So that makes sense. But the benefit of science is the interesting aspect. Of this to me. Because science could mean so many things. And especially let's continue with this. As was done with other Johns Hopkins institutions, it was planned after visits and correspondence with similar institutions in Europe and America. Now there was, so I'm not going to bring it up because I want to try to keep this fast, but there were other colored orphan asylums. Most notably in New York, there was a big one that went as far as the 1940s. It was still open, and so I guess there were institutions of similar types in Europe as well, because Hopkins visited with them. And it's interesting when you think about potentially what could have been going on in the basements of these institutions, especially in the name of science. And I'm going to get to that in a little bit, I hope. So Johns Hopkins Orphan Asylum opened with 24 boys and girls. This number, I think, fluctuates among articles, but this one says 24. I think others say 26 or 28. Under Gilman and his successors, this orphanage was later changed to serve as an orphanage and training school for black female orphans, principally as domestic workers, and next as an orthopedic convalescent home. And orthopedic convalescent is in quotes, and school for colored crippled here in quotes, children and orphans. The asylum was eventually closed in 1924, nearly 50 years after it opened, and was never reopened. And that's all they talk about it in the Johns Hopkins bit, but there's some interesting things in here. Again, at least in terms of information provided. So it started with boys and girls, but then was switched to just girls, which is interesting, right? And then it says that they were trained as domestic workers. And again, I want you to focus on the word worker, because words and language are spells, right? Worker and slave are interchangeable words, right? As we know, because we are slaves to an imaginary currency, the greatest con ever perpetrated. In my mind, really, is the modern banking and fiat currency and things of this nature. It's staggeringly unbelievable to me. But hey, we all live our lives this way, right? This is the paradigm we're in. So again, I like this word worker, right? And then next, as an orthopedic convalescent home, right? And school for colored crippled children. So it's interesting, what was crippling the children, and there's more, and as I find out, there's we'll go on about that. So this is one of the buildings that I believe could be the first orphanage that guy designed, right? And I love this building, the way it looks here. I love this Gothic architecture. I think it looks great. So I'm fairly confident there is one other building that comes up, which I'll show you later on, because I just gave you guys a spoiler as to where the story is going there for a second. So I wanted to find out more about the Colored Orphan Asylum, right? And so this just, kind of reiterates most of that basic information. So this says in 1913 is when it was switched over to convalescent and crippled, who needed received orthopedic treatment at John. So I wonder what, at that time, and especially when you think about the vaccination agenda and things of that nature, they want to push the polio theory, so those types of diseases are out there crippling children. And it's interesting that Hopkins provided a special place just for colored children and people who are, and orphans who were crippled by these diseases, if not other means, because again, this could mean anything. It doesn't really say it doesn't say why or how these kids were crippled. But the interesting thing about this article is that it lists that there are records that are available, right? They can be found in minutes of the hospital's Board of Trustees, right? There's a minute book of the committee from 1898 to 1905. And then there's financial records from 1895 to 1923. And so these are allegedly here are available through the Johns Hopkins archive. I don't know if I can get them, not being a student of Johns Hopkins, but I wonder if perhaps that information might be shareable to the Baltimore main branch library. So I'm going to look into that because I'm interested in this story. Again, because science. We're going to find out about that, I hope. So I wanted to find out more, and I found this article, which was crazy. The Johns Hopkins Colored Orphan Asylum token. Right? And so this has a little bit different information, but also reiterates a lot of the same. But this is Johns Hopkins, a Quaker and a strong proponent of abolition, was a Baltimore businessman who made his fortune in business as well as in the railroads. And I gotta tell you, I've read this sentence a couple of times now, and this is one of my favorite sentences. He was a Baltimore businessman who made his fortune in business. It's genius. As well as in the railroads, which was also a business. It says the same thing 3 times. I love it. So upon his death, it was intention to set up the university, but also finance an orphanage for Baltimore's homeless African American children. And this goes back to the and this they talk about the same thing. So it traced its root at the time to the Civil War, originally conceived by members of the Society of Friends. The institution's inception actually came about to meet the needs of Baltimore's contraband population. Now, this gets interesting to me because for the first thing they say contraband, right, which means illegals. Which is interesting because you could, if you wanted to, conversely transplant elements of the story to the modern time, you would look at how mass immigration is affecting things today, right? So the society, they created this institution and the needs of the Baltimore contraband population, the illegals coming in to Baltimore, right? Escaped slaves who were allegedly someone else's property, right? And that's the way the narrative is put out there. All right, so it says, a free city behind Union lines, Baltimore was, and that's by force, by the way, if I'm not mistaken. Baltimore was made to be Union by Lincoln. He turned the cannons on the Inner Harbor. He turned the cannons on Baltimore to keep it Union. That story could be hearsay, but I remember that story from somewhere. It was home to a number of runaway slaves whose children had pressing needs for food and shelter. It was this institution, upon Hopkins' death, that became the Colored Orphan Asylum. So I want to talk very briefly about the Society of Friends and the Quakers, and it's Baltimore. It's going to explode out of Baltimore, the ties to religion and state and their lack of separation and what could possibly be going on in Baltimore. Baltimore is one of the most important cities in the last 500 years, and I shit you not. And because so much crazy stuff happens out of Baltimore, and I think one of the reasons I could say that is because of how under the radar the city is, and I believe that is done purposefully. And I'm going to talk about that, I hope, in this episode, if I can get there fast enough. So, so these things were open in the Civil War for, philanthropic, these entrepreneurs were doing this, and the record tells us for their good. But it says Hopkins's vision was for an orphanage that cared for both girls and boys. Indeed, it was his hope that his orphanage would become a nurturing home for upwards of 400 children. However, after the asylum opened, its mission was changed. 400. Now, remember, we learned that it opened with only, what did they say, 24 boys and girls. And then he wanted it to be for boys and girls, but its mission was changed. A shelter for friendless colored children. This is the original ad, I guess, one of them. And I love that the name, the word that they use here is friendless, not parentless. They have parents out there somewhere. They're friendless. I don't know how to feel about that. And again, it's the manipulation of the language. And I also like that if I get this one out today, it will be on Valentine's Day, and this guy's name was, the president of it at the time was Julian Valentine. Where once it was intended for both girls and boys, its trustees soon began only accepting orphaned girls. And in addition to Hopkins's goal to provide education and shelter, its girls were trained in domestic work and were put to work in homes of prominent families throughout Baltimore. Let's see, work. Hopkins's dream was never fully realized. By 1892, his orphanage sheltered a mere 28 African American girls. All right, and says it only takes 28 restricted at present to girls owing to limited quarters. It's interesting that they would restrict the sex of the orphans to their quarters. Like they couldn't still just have an equal number. And divide them among the rooms, boys and girls. But children are taken from between the ages of 2 and 8. They are trained in household work and may be bound out, remaining in all cases under the oversight of the asylum until 18. On leaving, homes are found and necessary outfit given. So I look at this looks more like a graduation to me. On leaving, homes are found and necessary outfit given. They're given jobs and families, right? But they're not slaves, right? They were educated and, begun during the war as a shelter for colored children, notably of contrabands, chiefly by the extension of members of okay, this is the same information. I gotta move on here. In 1913, they moved it over to a convalescent home for crippled colored children who received orthopedic treatment at Johnson. And I'm going to get into that in a second, I hope. So this is the years, and they say that they uprooted the shelter. But this is what I wanted to get to, all right, because I was a little too much repeat information here. There exist several token emissions of the Johns Hopkins Colored Orphan Asylum. Raulu reports 3 varieties consisting of 1 cent, 5 cent, and 10 cent denominations, while Shankman reports 2. All right. Physically, all 3 varieties possess a reverse that depicts a numeral and a sun ray pattern. There exist 2 known engravers who frequently utilized a sun ray design. Right, so they eliminate it to the guy in Baltimore because they're rocket scientists, and so here they are, right? Well, here's one of them, and I'm guessing this is a 1 cent, and that this represents 1. But to me, it looks like a scroll. There are 14 rays, 16 if you want to include the tops of the scroll. There's an upright pentagram. This is 1867. So I don't understand. I didn't know what a token emission was, so I had to find out. And it's fundraising, right? Or it's an investment, right? Initial coin offering, right, are these tokens, and this goes into cryptocurrencies. So I thought that was really an interesting connection to make to a story about the colored orphan houses and being investments. What were they investing in? And so when I think about that, I think about what was said back here. Nothing was wanting that could benefit science and humanity. And what could science mean? And what's the investment aspect? What are you investing in these orphanages, especially with a small number now? Because you're looking for a return on your investment. What is the return on these orphan asylum tokens? All right, and so I came across an interesting picture that I'm going to share. When I was trying, and this is the other house that may or may not be. I mean, I didn't search for their addresses. I don't know why. So I hope one of those 2 houses. And this one I could see limiting the 400 down, but certainly more than 28 kids could be taken care of in this structure, if that's indeed the place where they moved to, or even started at. All right, here's the picture I wanted to find. Now, this picture is really interesting. This is not at least to my knowledge, not the Baltimore Colored Children Orphan Asylum. If only because these don't look all like girls. There could be some girls in here, but these look like boys to me. And one thing I wanted to, when I first saw this picture, of course, when I was a kid, I grew up and I absolutely was addicted to the Little Rascals. It was on every Sunday before church. And Little Rascals and the Three Stooges, loved it. Ate it up as a small child. Loved them. And so when I first saw this picture, I thought of Stymie without his hat, his big old bowler. And it was, I think it was Bear out there. He mentioned, how stovepipe hats and could cover cranial deformity, like elongated skulls and so forth. And I thought, that bowlers and derby type hats could do the same. And that made me think of, well, it didn't make it at the time. It just, Stymie came up when I saw all these, little black kids, and I'm going to say it that way. I'm sorry. In my private life, I'm the least politically correct person in the world, but I make no judgments on anyone, based on their, and that's one of the things I'm going to go with this story is about how communal Baltimore is as a city and how its perception in the American theater and perhaps the world theater is drastically wrong, But anyway, so getting to these kids and the science. I was looking at them and I was trying to determine whether or not this could be the Baltimore. And like I said, I was looking at these kids, could they be boys and girls? And I was looking at their heads and how some of their heads, seem to be casting pointed shadows or making their craniums here seem to come to a bulbous almost point on some of them. Right? And I think that interesting feature. And it's not on all of them. And I also notice in here that some of these kids are, certainly of mixed race, if not outright Caucasian. So again, I don't think this was from Baltimore. But when I think about the science and I think about experiments and I think about what we at least speculate is happening today with the control of frequencies and, they had to learn how to do this. They needed test subjects. They had to do that kind of sort of research on the science, and I don't know. I don't think it's too far of a stretch to think what better, if you're going to be testing out frequencies on brain waves and how your brains operate, you're going to be, strapping electrodes to, get your results. At the time you need a source, and then also you want to play into the more sinister sides of, what may have been happening, with these orphanages, I mean, there's got to be lines of research out there already dedicated to that. But, I don't know. I was looking at their skulls, and I'm thinking, these could be test subjects, and that's what the science of it is. And again, when you try to read into the narrative of what the value, they tell us the value of African American lives were in the 1800s and earlier in America. They say there was no value, right? Because they were slaves, right? That's the narrative that they're pitching. Okay, so I'm gonna wrap it up a little bit here. Just finish it off quickly. I went on a much longer tangent about the history of Baltimore and slavery and things like this, and there's very, very interesting stories to tell there, and I've got a lot of episodes of Mud City to make, so I'm going to save it. But I did want to round out with some more observations about this really quickly, and then wrap it up. And one of the things that when you think about the research aspect of it, and testing out these technologies that they were finding, especially because it's all brainwashing and type technologies. Could that be responsible for some cranial deformities, which I think is very interesting to think about. And when you think about the fact that if what's in our history is true, and they didn't value the lives of African Americans, or Africans, slaves, then it would be easy to just use them as test subjects, right? And one thing that I wanted to point out, I don't know if I did a good enough job of pointing this out before because it's just so striking to me, um, was his intention was for boys and girls up to 400, but then by 1892, less than 20 years, or about 20 years after the orphanage opens, had a mere 28 African American girls, and this ad talks about taking in girls due to limited quarters. And so, where are the boys? What were they doing with the boys? Who was getting the boys to experiment on, or train, or do whatever it is that they were doing with them? And again, I know maybe it seems sinister to take the investigation in that route, but I don't see how we can't, And I think it should be done in a way that, treats race as not so much the sensitive issue here, but just as an observational one, just observing what's here. And there is a lot to go into about race and relations, and the manipulation of our history and the narratives that they create, because it does run down into today, and in very violent, unpleasant ways. And I think a lot of that is completely fabricated, and we're going to get into that in other episodes. So I'm going to wrap this one up. I hope you enjoyed the trip down memory lane to the Johns Hopkins Colored Orphan Asylum, and what could have been going on there. Close out with that picture because I love this building. And so please, everyone, be well and take care of yourselves and each other, right? And until the next one, cheers, guys.